Hi, this is Pastor John Hall, and this is Let's Talk Timeline with Pastor John Hall. This is the third podcast. We've had two before it. We talked about Ptolemy's king list was a really big deal. We're going to review that quickly. And also all the years and all the verses you need to know to count the timeline in the Bible from Adam all the way down to Jesus. Now, the reason for this is because a lot of people are confused about timeline. There's so many people saying so many different things, and it sounds like it's impossible to know. So this is about learning how timelines are put together, where these numbers are coming from, so that when you are looking at a timeline, you can see what's going on. Our next podcast is about prophetic things and people using their timeline to say so many years for Sabbath years and years of Jubilee. So we're going to be covering that in the fourth podcast, and I think that would be very interesting. We got about 30 minutes here. We're going to take a few minutes to review what we did in the past, and then we're going to get started. Thanks for joining me. Okay, so here is our review very quickly and very succinctly. So this chart here has all the years and all the verses. And what it is on the left side is all the events that the Bible uses to count the years. So Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 take us from Adam to Abram's birth, for example. And then it says 75 years from Abram getting his call to his birth to his call. And then the Exodus, that's talking about how many years from Abram down to Moses, and that's 430. So this is what it's all about. You can look at that at the end of the day, and you can check all these verses. They're big time verses, not small ones like every year and a half or 2 years or 3. It's very difficult to do that. Like the kings are very hard to chart. But we have Ezekiel, for example, and it gives us a big number to tie into. So starting with Adam all the way down to Jesus' baptism, 3,960 years. You can check it out yourself. Maybe you would disagree, but you have to have a reason for that. Now, let's look at a very important thing, which is this Ezekiel's 430 years of sin. Now, the reason why this is important is because going through the kings is very, very difficult. You know, a lot of people can't do that. It's, you got to check everything out. It's very cumbersome. Like taking a big walk down through some kind of forest and you're trying to hike through it and trying to figure out all the signposts you're getting, creeks that you can fall into. So Ezekiel's 430 years solves a lot of problems because in the 3,000th year, it says the temple is completed, and this is Solomon's 11th year. And then all the way down, the next big time that we're looking at is the 7 years of captivity. So we need the number of years from the 11th year of Solomon all the way down to captivity. How many years are there? Well, this is a great way to find this out because God told Ezekiel to lie on his side for 390 days, representing 390 years for the sins of Israel. And then get on his right side and lie there for 40 days as a symbol of the 40 years of Judah that he called those sin years too. And so when he did this, it's very specific. In Ezekiel chapter 1, it's very specific. It's the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's, and that's 13 years deep into the captivity. So what we want to do here to find out all the big number for the kings is you want to look at the temple, which is 11 years into the Solomon, and you want to look into taking off the 13 years of the captivity, and you end up with 406 years for that time period, and that is extremely helpful. Now, Ptolemy's king list is another big thing. We've talked about it endlessly. You need to look at that in the first podcast especially, but here is how all the dates actually come up. So this king list was in the back of a book of a guy named Claudius Ptolemy. He was very genius. He had all this stuff. He was an inventor, astronomer, mathematician, Leonardo da Vinci guy of his time. And in the back of one of his books, he put this king list with these numbers related to each ruler. And after that, and starting the 2nd century on, they filled in the history using this as the basis for dating everything. So what happened was strictly followed. If you look in the bottom left-hand side, there's Nebuchadnezzar. It's actually Nabokolassar in that spelling, but it's 605 BC. Now that's very familiar to Bible people. Oh, when was the Babylonian captivity start? Oh, 605. And then Cyrus in 539 BC. Not so many people know that one, but Alexander the Great on the green at the top, 333 BC. It seems like you hear that every once in a while, even on TV. So how did these dates come up? Well, you just start on the right side, count backwards, add up the years, and there you have the number of years. This is really important because people think that these things were actually done in different ways, or they just know. They just did the research and they just know how many years it is. But this is actually the basis of it all. Now, Ptolemy had two big problems. Want to go quickly over this. Even recently, they moved Caesar Augustus' reign years from 30 to 27. This is a big deal because it's one big long unified, list of names and numbers. So if they moved Augustus, shouldn't they move Alexander the Great, Cyrus? Shouldn't they move Nebuchadnezzar back or forward, however you want to think about that, 3 years? They really wouldn't think about doing that because most people don't realize that it is connected to Ptolemy's king list. And besides, it feels, they're just all over everywhere, these dates. It'd be like painful to go back and take 3 years off or whatever. But here's a bigger issue, is the problem number 2 is in Ezra chapter 4, because Ptolemy's king list, and this really plays into the dates you see in your Bible. Ptolemy's king lists 3 different kings separately because Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes are listed with 3 different people, 3 different kings, 3 different number of years that they reigned. But Ezra chapter 4 says it's 3 names for the same king. Well, this is a huge thing because there's a 62 more years in Ptolemy's king list. And at the end of this podcast, we're going to look at that briefly. And so this really makes it different because it confirms, if you take out those 62 years, that Cyrus was not 539. He was actually 454. And he's the one that had the decree that we should count for Daniel's 483 years that goes from the decree down to the coming of Jesus. So that's really big. We shouldn't use Ezra. We shouldn't use Nehemiah. We don't even have to. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that at the end. So now this podcast, we're going to quickly go through 3 different things. There are major differences in all timelines. They're not that difficult to understand, but they are important. So the differences are people putting gaps in the genealogy between Shem, which is Noah's son, and Terah, which is Abraham's father. We have a lot of people believe there were 400 years of slavery in Egypt, which they weren't. And also, people are using the Ptolemy's king list and another one, a Syrian king list, and they're connecting that to the Bible events. And so the dates in your Bible are not Bible dates, they're Ptolemy's king list dates. And so that's not super important. So it's off by 50, 60, 70 years. But if people are trying to make something out of that, like, okay, from this point in time to this point in time is so many years, and because of that, we know this about the future. Well, that's a problem because the years are wrong. Now, first we need to know a very important thing, and it's Dr. John Whitcomb, because he co-authored the book, The Genesis Flood, with Dr. Henry Morris. And this book, powerful book, ignited the current creationist movement. And people like Ken Ham, a lot of people have heard of him, Answers in Genesis. And have you visited Noah's Ark in Kentucky? That's the guy, that's the organization we're talking about. So Dr. Whitcomb was a professor at Grace Theological Seminary, and this is what happened. He created a timeline, but all the creationists know who he is, and so they were talking to him, and he produced these timelines in a card form. In fact, I have a set right here. I got my set back then. A lot of people might have one that they have. Not everybody knows about them. If you're older and went to Bible school or seminary back in the day, you would have gotten it because the seminaries and Bible colleges adopted them. And so they look like this. There's actually 6 of them for the different years. Charts are very, very tiny, and but all the dates are in there, and this is it. So when you're looking at a date in the Bible, wow, 90% of them, all the dates, qualified, of course, are actually his dates. So with knowing that, let's look at the differences. So what happened was Whitcomb charted some gaps between Shem and Terah. And why did he do that? Well, because, let's back up just a little bit. Whitcomb believes Scripture is without error, all right? There's no question about that. He is not liberal in any sense of the word. He's not saying the Bible is incorrect, but he does believe there are gaps in the specifically in Genesis chapter 11 between Shem and Terah. Now, why does he believe that? Well, what happened was his colleagues from digs, archaeological digs, they came back from Israel and said, look, we've been in there, we're looking at all these pottery things, and wow, it just seems like that if you don't have any gaps in the genealogy between the flood and now, wow, it just doesn't seem right. It just like it's not old enough, because if you don't have any gaps, it's going to be no more than about 2500 BC, and we just don't believe that. Now, these are conservative archaeologists. They're not liberal people. They're not from secular universities. These are from Christian universities, Christian seminaries. So they concluded, well, we're not feeling comfortable with 2500 BC, but maybe 4, 5, 6, 7,000, 8,000 maybe. Now, the thing about this is they all have different views, and there's no way to say, well, we're not sure exactly. They don't really talk about it. The point of it is, if you believe in gaps, there's gaps, and if you don't believe it, there aren't, and that definitely impacts your timeline. So whether you believe in gaps or not, I want to cover this point because we're all on the same team here, right? All believe the Bible is without error, including the numbers, so we're not talking, again, about liberal people versus conservative. So it doesn't help in this argument to say, well, these people don't believe the Bible, and that's why they put gaps in there. This is not helpful, and it's actually not true. So we're all, again, on the same team, and so we have to understand that this is not about believing the Bible or not the Bible. That's not what's going on. So it's important to realize that Whitcomb came up with the first firm date he felt, BC date he felt you could chart in the timeline, in a Bible timeline, and this is 2295 for Terah's birth, which is Abraham's father. And so he talked about it in Genesis Flood, the book he has, pages 474 and forward. At any rate, because of the gaps, he had to come up with, when do we know that there's no more gap problem? Well, Terah's birth, because we know Terah was definitely the father of Abraham. And so that's what he did. Now, Whitcomb is the only one with a 2295 BC date because of his timeline. The way he put it together is uniquely his. But if you see a book that has the date 2295 for Terah, then all the rest of the dates are his. And I bet you'll find it almost everywhere you look, resource books, encyclopedias, Bible books, notes in the bottom of your Bible. It's going to say 2295. It's going to say that we can't date when Adam or creation took place or when Adam sinned. So, just a little side note here. How does each of them, if you have gaps or no gaps, how do you view one day equals 1,000 years? So, if you're a person who feels really strongly about 7 days, 7,000 year time frame from Adam to the final judgment as a way of God making history, then you definitely are going to do no gaps in their timeline. And I'm kind of in that camp. And but there's a lot of people who don't feel that way. So if you do have gaps, then in terms of this 1,000 years, you can't say 6 days from Adam because there's gaps, but you can say that, well, there's about 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus, 2,000 years for the church, 1,000 years for millennial reign. And in that sense, one day is 1,000 years. So it's not that it can't be used at all, you just can't start with Adam. So everyone has to decide. Are there gaps in the genealogy? You have to decide what you want to believe. Many reasons why people say yes, many reasons why people say no. Maybe there's, you've got colleagues that you don't even want to talk about it because they just would be ridiculing you. Maybe you got friends, neighbors, or whatever that really believe that the world is millions of years old. And so this little gap does help, doesn't help. It doesn't matter. A lot of people don't discuss it. So it's not worth arguing over. But it is major, obviously, because if you have gaps, you definitely have a different view of the timeline from Adam to Jesus. Now, obviously, we're all still counting up the years the same. So, from example, Adam to Noah, everybody agrees is 1,656 years was the year that the Noah's flood took place. So it's not about counting the years or trickery or anything like that. Now, the second difference is really important, and this is the one that a lot of people do. And a lot of people just reading the Bible, come to this conclusion, and it's not hard to come to that conclusion. So Whitcomb also misinterpreted Genesis 15. This is important, and I'm going to be bold here. I think he did misinterpret it, but I'm going to show you the verses and see what you think. So it is easy to do. And so he put 430 years in Egypt, of which 400 is in slavery. And I believe Galatians chapter 3, verses 16, 17 is pretty clear. There was only 215 years in Egypt because it talks about 430 years total. And of those 215 years, only about 120 was slavery. And I'm going to show you a little chart to explain that. It's still a lot of years of slavery, 400 years of slavery. I mean, that's almost way beyond, it's way beyond the United States when we started. Obviously, people came here in the 1600s. But the point of it is, 400 years is a very long time. Now, this is what Galatians 3 says. The promises were spoken to Abraham. What I mean is this. The law that Moses gave, introduced 430 years later, that is, after Abraham, does not set aside God's promise. So what is being said here, it's talking about the law and the promise. But our information we're picking out of this, well, it's 430 years from Abraham to Moses. And that was what Paul said. Obviously, he's not wrong about that. So there it is. Now, if you don't have looking into the New Testament to find out your answers, well, then you might miss that. So what does this look like? Real simple. Abraham, Moses, 430 years. Not that difficult. That's what Galatians is saying. Now, why is this happening? Because Genesis 15:13 is easy to misinterpret. It looks like it's saying there's 400 years of slavery. And here's what it says. Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. Okay, what we do is we connect the last phrase with the second one, enslaved and mistreated there, thinking that the verse is saying all the time that they're down in Egypt, they're down there and they're being enslaved, and it's for 400 years. Now, this is what is really going on. The 400 years and the 430. It has to do with when Ishmael mocks Isaac. Now, most people don't even know about this story, or they've heard of it, they don't really understand what does it mean. Very important in terms of our timeline because the 30 years goes from the time that Abram entered into Canaan till Isaac was weaned at 5 years old. So Isaac was born when he was 100. 5 years later, they had this big celebration. And at that time, Ishmael mocks him at this feast. And here is the story. In Genesis 21, the child grew and was weaned. So Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that Ishmael was mocking. That's the exact word in there in NIV. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for he will never share in the inheritance with Isaac." Well, that's a pretty big statement. Now, Paul refers to this in Galatians chapter 4. Maybe you've read it and you just didn't understand what was going on. Paul said, "Now you, like Isaac, are children of promise. At that time, the son born according to the flesh, that is Ishmael, persecuted, mocked the son born by the power of the Spirit." So he's making a point there. He's referring to that story. And so that is an important story, and it is an important one in our timeline. So what does this demand? It demands that there's 430 years from Abraham to Moses, that there's 25 years when before Abraham has Isaac, but then Isaac is born, and then 5 years later, then Ishmael mocks Isaac when he's being weaned for a total of 30 years. So you can see it's 30 and then 400. That's how it fits together. It doesn't look that way, though. When you read Genesis 15:13, you're just going through, wow, 400 years in Egypt in slavery. That's what it looks like. But that's not what's happening. Galatians chapter 3 says it's impossible. That's not what happened. Now, let's look at what it would look like to have 200, because what happened, there was 430 years, 215 occurred, and then the last 215, half of them, they went down to Egypt. So they went down to Egypt, and time was good. There was a lot of good time down there in Egypt until all that generation died, right? And it says in Exodus chapter 1, once all that generation died, then slavery came. Well, Levi was 137 when that happened, and they were in there for 95 years. Now, we also know, just to clarify, we also know that Moses was born, and 80 years later, he returns for the Exodus. Now, we know that he was the first year, or the first time that the Pharaoh said, "Hey, let's kill all the male newborns." Now, remember, his older brother, Aaron, 3 years older, he wasn't having that problem. So this killing the males thing started when Moses was born. So how many years does that leave? Well, it leaves 40 years. And what we're saying is the new king came after that generation died, no more than 40 years. And then Moses was born. Now, during that time, slavery began, and then it got worse and worse and worse. So 120 years of being oppressed in there at the most. Now, these 400 years of slavery, we also want to see how it doesn't work if you realize that you have in Egypt, the first 95 years are good years. So if you say you have 400 years in Egypt, but the brothers are doing well for the first 95, that leaves 335, and so that's not enough. That's not enough years. So even in that sense, we know because slavery didn't start until after Levi. After Levi died, at the very earliest, then it started. So just can't happen. Now, here's another really problematic verse, and this is the reason why so many people get this wrong, because you're just reading through there, and this is exactly what it seems like it's saying. It's saying that there's 400 years of being, or 430 years of being in Egypt. So it says, now the length of time the Israelite people, doesn't say Israel, in terms of Israel being Jacob. It says the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. So, wow, there it is, 430 years living in Egypt. Well, how can that not be wrong? And then it says at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. So you go, wow, but there's a note there, and the note is this, that in the Samaritan Pentateuch, in the Septuagint, and I think that this is what really happened, it says Egypt and Canaan. And even if it didn't, I know that that's what they knew it to be true. And so the idea of being in Egypt was the idea that they were, again, Ishmael was part Egyptian. And so this whole persecution by the Egyptians started when Isaac was mocked by Ishmael. So we must connect then the 430 years in Exodus 12:40, not to when they first went down into Egypt with Jacob and the brothers, but when Abram actually went down there. When he first got there was a famine. People don't even know about that. So let's look at this. In Genesis chapter 12, there's this story. You got to zip right by it if you're not careful. So Abram was 75 when they set out for Canaan and arrived there. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt because the famine was severe. Now a lot of people, oh yeah, I remember there's a famine. Yeah, he ran down there, and then he had this problem with Sarah and all that was going on. I remember that story, but they don't really realize that this is when the 430 years began. And so what happened was Abram goes to Egypt, and then 430 years later, they exit from Egypt. And so when Abram goes down to Egypt, and he goes the first day he gets there, crosses the border, it's foreshadowing the Passover, which actually happens 430 years later to the very day. Okay, that's how that works. And I know it's really, and you just read Genesis chapter 15, verse 30, and then Exodus, and you go, wow, 400 years, gotta be, that's what it is. Don't need to look any further than that. And so that's why Wickham made a mistake. And that's why it's easy for us to make mistakes. So Galatians chapter 3 saves us. Also, Levi dies before slavery begins, and so that's impossible anyway because he wasn't passed away until 95 years being down there in Egypt. Now, this adds 250 years to Wickham's timeline, which is really big because that's a lot of years to add to your timeline. But fortunately, it doesn't even happen until way back in the time of the Exodus and before that. So a lot of people go, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't really affect the storyline. I know what the stories are. What does it matter? But if you're trying to do a timeline and trying to figure out from Adam all the way down to Weber in 2030 or some other point in time when there's 6,000 years or whatever you want to do, well, you can't have 215 extra years in that timeline and think, well, you're good to go. You got to know that that's not correct. So remember, Wickham's dates are everywhere. This is big. So if you see something here and here and here, you look at 5 different references, 5 different encyclopedias, 15 different footnotes, and 15 different Bibles, and they all are saying the same information. And you go, well, everybody must agree. And what everybody agrees on is that they're using his timeline. That's what they're agreeing on, and then everybody agrees. So many mistakenly chart 400 years in Egypt. Big deal. If you're going to compare timelines, check for that error. And if you're doing a timeline, don't have that error. Let's, at least leave that out. Try to figure out something else, but don't put an extra 215 years in your timeline when it is clearly not correct. So difference number 3, and again, this is really pretty short because we've talked about it a lot. Use Ptolemy and the Assyrian king list. Do we use them or don't we use them? It's a decision you make. I think we ought to use Ezekiel's 430 years for the king years, and you use Daniel's 483 years from Cyrus to Jesus. But if you're going to use the Ptolemy, that's what everybody's using. So if you're going to use Ezekiel, and nobody's doing that necessarily, or very few people are doing it. So it is kind of going against the tide. And it's a lot easier to say, oh, well, 605 is fine. What does it really matter? Okay. So here, though, it's important to understand about Bishop Ussher and Dr. Wickham. You say, well, why did they use it? I mean, aren't they Christians? Don't they know what they're doing? Didn't they do the research? Well, what they said, and Wickham said this specifically, that he believed the dates were scientifically verified by eclipses and other astronomical observations. He makes that in one of his notes in the book, Genesis Flood, and in his chart. So, again, when they're looking everywhere, everybody is saying all the dates are the same. So, I mean, you have to go out of your way to disagree with that because nobody's disagreeing with it. But nobody really, or few people know, it's really built on Ptolemy's king list. It's just, well, that's what it is, and it's verified, and everybody knows that. And we're past questioning that. So, but as we said, all the dates on the king list add up exactly what they need to be. So it's clear that it's not coming from eclipses and so forth. So Wickham also then added the Syrian king list, and that makes it so he has different years for the kings than even Ussher does. We'll look at that in a minute. But here is an important, I just want to show you what you're up against. I mean, if you're Wickham, if you're Ussher, and you're putting together what everybody else is saying, well, in the book by Ussher called Annals of the World, they numbered every paragraph. So you can look in there and say, well, paragraph number 1578. So that's where this is coming from. It was a year on his book for 382 BC. And remember, there's a 62-year error. And remember that they changed the dates. So I don't think you can say that Ptolemy's years are correct. They just aren't correct. But listen to this quote and realize, this is kind of extreme. You don't get this much detail, but this is what you read. And when you read this, you think, well, that has to be correct. They know what they're doing. They know what they're talking about. So the quote is this: when Evander was governor of Athens in the month of Posidion, in the 367th year of Nebuchadnezzar's, so that would be Nebuchadnezzar's account, on the 16th day of the month of Toth, at 9:30 p.m., on December 12th, 382 BC, there was a third lunar eclipse observed in Babylon. This was a total eclipse. So we know that that's all correct because we have all this information, and James Ussher had that information, and Wickham had that information, and nobody had any different information. So when he created his timeline back in the 60s, they just followed it, and James Ussher, he followed it too. I mean, they're all in agreement there. So here's an important thing about the solar eclipses, though. So you think, wow, Babylon had, they're sitting there and they got this total eclipse. I mean, how often does that happen? Well, it happens about every 18 years. So the solar eclipse is going around, the cycle is 18 years, 11 days. And so every 18 years, you're going to see the same phenomena. So they could have seen, or did see, or absolutely for certainly saw a full eclipse in Babylon. But it could have been 18 years earlier or later, however you want to look at it. Or they could be off 36 years. And I think that's what happened. So it's not like these eclipses don't happen, and they happen very regularly. So they just, picked a date that fit their timeline. So at any rate, Ussher's and the historians, their comments sound convincing. And so you have to make a decision. Do I want to go against that and say, no, I'm going to use the years based on Cyrus down to Jesus and make that 483 years, because that's what Daniel's 69 weeks includes, and I'm going to stick to that, and I'm going to chart it that way. Or do I use the king list? Now, there's the Syrian list too. So I just want to throw out this one thing, just So you want to know how. So what did they do when Whitcomb and these people dated Zerubbabel, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah? They used Ptolemy's king list, and this is how it turned out. So if you use the three king names as three separate names the way Ptolemy does, and you chart it, then you end up where Ezra is in 458 BC. And 454 is what I believe is a very, very valid year to say Cyrus was 454. So you're only a few years off. Nehemiah is 445. So if you want to say there's 483 years between Ezra and Jesus' baptism in 26 AD or some other thing, and you're really close. So there's another reason why it's really strange in a way, but it comes out to be very close. So you have all this information. Why would you disagree? Why would you even think about the idea that it's really Cyrus down and we got too many years and we simply don't see it? So let's look at the big numbers. Now, we're coming to the end of this podcast, actually coming to the end of this whole part of the three podcasts, because we're going to look at the big numbers. What does this mean? Well, you go from Adam to Abram's birth. What are you going to have? Most people are going to have 2008. That's the 60, part of the 61 verses. Usher said 2008. John Whitcomb said there are gaps. Okay, remember you have to have Acts 7, 2 through 4, or else you'll date Terah at 70 rather than 130 years old, which he really was. Then you'll come up with the wrong number of years. So everybody understands there's 75 years between the time that Abram was born and he went into Canaan. 430 years for the Exodus, but as we said, Whitcomb thought it was 645. A lot of people do. They don't know about Galatians 3, so they make a mistake. And so to me, that's a clear error. Then Exodus to temple start, everybody agrees with that. 480 years, no disagreement. Another 7 years, no disagreement. Okay, then you end up in the Kings. And I believe it's clear it's 406. I think Ezekiel really helps us out there. But if you don't do that, and Usher just went through there and charted the Kings himself, well, he came up with 398. In other words, I think he was 8 years off. But wow, that's not hard. I mean, wow. All those kings, all those dates, all those things. There's a co-reigns and all kinds of stuff. Only 8 years difference. That's not a big deal. But Whitcomb also used a Syrian king list, so his time for the kings was actually 358. When he tried to fit it together, he wasn't changing what he believed the Bible said. He just fitted in to what he thought was the actual scientific dates, and he made it fit. And that's how the timeline is, and that's why the dates that you will see, for example, 722, for when Israel is taken captive by and taken into captivity by Assyria, that date is coming from Ptolemy's king list, and then it's coming from the Assyrian king list. It's not necessarily coming from the Bible. Not that it matters necessarily, what's a few years in terms of most people's minds about the faith or whatever, but what we're trying to do is be accurate about the Bible timeline. Now, 70 years for captivity, everybody agrees with that. And then when we come down from Cyrus down to Jesus, then Ptolemy's going to come up with 569. And then this is really an important point. When you get down from Adam down to Jesus, you do have to pick a date. You have to say, I'm going to connect the Old Testament with the New Testament, and I'm going to connect it with his baptism or his cross. I think baptism is it because that's the only date in the New Testament. Luke chapter 3 says, in the 15th year of Caesar Tiberius, Jesus was born. Only date in the entire New Testament. I think you have to connect it with his baptism, but some people believe his baptism 26. Some people it's 30, different dates in there. You have to pick, and that's going to change your timeline by a few years, right? So that's really, really important. Now, what happened was, this is an interesting thing for those who want to follow Usher, because Usher went down and he agreed with Ptolemy all the way down to Jesus being baptized in 26 AD. Then he charted Jesus being dying in 33 AD, which makes him 36 years old when he dies. Nobody believes this. Nobody believes that Jesus' ministry was for 6 years. I don't even know why he decided to do that. You can read what he says, and he's got this thing about the Passovers, and at the end of the day, he tried to go with Dionysius, who created the timeline and the AD BC dates, and he charted at 33 AD, and I guess he thought, well, he's got to be right, and so I got to figure out a way to make this work, and so he's got him at baptism at 26 AD, and then he's crucified at 33 AD, and he's 36 years old when he is crucified, which nobody actually believes. So what are the totals then? Let's look at the totals. The totals for what I think is correct is Adam through 70 AD is 4,000 years. Now, I believe if you use those verses and follow them right down and count them up on a calculator, you will come up with 4,000 years. But Ussher, using Ptolemy, came up with 4,074, and John Wickham came up with 4,247. So you wonder why Ussher said creation was in 4004 BC. Well, there it is, right there, down through there, and he had fewer years for the kings, and then he came down and did this kind of different thing for the baptism at 26, and living, ministering for 6 years that nobody believes till 33, and so you have to take those 3 years off, and you end up with 4,074 years from Adam to 70 AD. So take off the 70 years for AD. Now, how many years you have left for the BC date? 4,004 years. You may have never known how he came up with 4,004 years. Now you know. Glad you listened to this. We're kind of coming down to the end here, but we just want to wrap it up by saying a few things. There's only 3 major issues here. Do we have gaps? That's a decision you have to make. Do you have the right number of years for the slavery? Are you going to use the Assyrian king list? Are you going to use Ptolemy's king list? And then there's only 2 minor issues. Did you get it right about Terah being 130, not 70? And which date are you going to pick for the baptism of Jesus? Where are you going to connect the Old Testament and New Testament? You have to decide whatever that is, and that will change your calendar by like 1 to 2 years, depending on what you want to do with that. So realize then that of all the different timelines that are Christian, there's only a 250-year difference between all of them, and that's Wickham, that's the most popular, and then Ussher that kind of agrees with Wickham, except that he doesn't have gaps, so he goes back to 4004, and then I believe there's 4,000 years only from Adam to 70 AD. Now, since 1 Kings 6:1 says 480 years from Exodus to Temple, remember that we don't have to get all the judges right. That's a really hard thing. People go through there. They have all kinds of different ways that they chart the kings. Doesn't matter, because from the Exodus to the Temple, it's 480 years. And if you use Ezekiel, you go, wow, we don't even have to be exactly right about the kings. We just follow Ezekiel's 430 years, and it turns out to be 406. And so it's much simpler to come up with the complete full summary of how many years there are than you would think. You don't have to do judges. You don't have to do the kings. And there aren't that many verses anyway. So want to take a break. Do want to talk about our next podcast, though, real quickly. This is the end of this part of our journey, but we're hoping that you can see the big picture, that maybe, we didn't get into the woods about this king, this judge, that judge, but this is the big picture. Hoping it helped, hoping you get a big idea. Now, for podcast number 4, I want to pitch this because it's coming out, and we're going to talk about, is the Hebrew calendar correct? Is 2030 AD AM, that is in the year, this Jewish way of talking about it, 5790? Is that correct? Everybody's using it. I hear it all the time. Well, this is the Jewish year, so-and-so, and therefore it's a Sabbath, and therefore whatever. And the question is the timeline even correct? Now, can people really know which years are Sabbath years and years of Jubilee. I'm going to tell you everything that you wanted to know in order to answer that question. Next podcast, that's what it's about. And then finally, the last thing is I want to show what people do when they want their timeline to look, I need a year, I need to take off a year, I need 3 years, I need 5 years. So what do they do to adjust it? Well, once you know what you're looking for, you're going to see what they did and why they did it. So thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. And if the Lord directs you, certainly please donate. The information's there on the screen. Just write in the memo or whatever, Pastor John or Timeline, and I would really appreciate it. Thank you for being a part of it, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we're looking forward to the next podcast, which will end this whole thing, 4 podcasts, all this information, and basically an hour and a half to 2 hours max. Thanks a lot. God bless.